The leather creaked beneath the judge's weight, a sound that echoed through the silent courtroom like a warning. Otanes shifted, feeling the unnatural warmth of the chair, the sensation of skin, human skin, pressed against his own. He tried not to think about whose skin it was, but the memory was impossible to escape. His father's face was sewn into the backrest, his eyes closed, and his mouth stitched shut, forever whispering the price of corruption. In ancient Persia, justice was not just a concept. It was a sentence, a spectacle, a lesson carved into flesh and memory. And for Otanes, it was a daily reminder that what we call normal is often just what we're willing to accept. You might think you know what's normal. You might believe that the past was a simpler, more innocent time. But history is not a story of progress. It's a record of what people were willing to do to each other in the name of order, purity, and power. In ancient Persia, a civilization that gave the world its first charter of human rights, the pursuit of cosmic order created horrors that would haunt bloodlines for centuries. Today, we're going to explore the shocking practices that were not just accepted, but celebrated in the heart of the Persian Empire. Practices that will make you question what normal really means. Let's begin with the story of the judge's chair. 6 months before Otanes took his seat, his father, Judge Sesamnes, had accepted a bribe. In most societies, corruption is punished with disgrace, maybe exile, and sometimes death. But King Cambyses too wanted a lesson that would echo through generations. First came the execution. Then, in front of a horrified crowd, the royal executioners flayed Sesamnes alive, peeling his skin with methodical precision. The skin was treated, stretched, and crafted into a chair, the seat of justice itself. And then, in a final act of psychological torture, the king appointed Sesamnes' own son to replace him. Every verdict Otanes delivered, every judgment he made, was rendered while sitting on the remains of his father. The king called it perfect justice. A judge would never forget the price of corruption while literally sitting on its consequences. This wasn't madness. This was Persian justice. In a civilization obsessed with purity, order, and the cosmic balance between good and evil, punishment was not just about the individual. It was about the message. The chair was a warning to every judge, every official, every citizen. The system will not just destroy you for your crimes, it will make your family complicit, your memory a tool of terror. The lesson was clear. Justice in Persia was not about mercy. It was about memory. And memory, in Persia, was a weapon. But the obsession with purity went far beyond the courtroom. In the deserts outside the city, another ritual unfolded every morning, a ritual that turned death into spectacle and grief into a test of faith. The vultures knew the schedule better than the priests. At dawn, they circled the massive stone towers, their shadows flickering across the sand as the sun rose. Below, a funeral procession approached in silence. No wailing, no crying. Sound itself was considered impure when death was near. The body they carried belonged to Arzhon, a respected merchant who had died 3 days before. His family walked behind, faces covered with white cloth, careful not to breathe too deeply. According to Zoroastrian law, a corpse became impure the moment life left it. To bury, it would contaminate the sacred earth. To burn, it would pollute the holy fire. To sink, it would poison the precious water. So they built towers, dakmas, open to the sky, where nature's cleaners could do their work without defiling the elements. At the top of the tower, the bearers, men whose profession made them permanently impure, arranged the body in the outer ring, alongside other men. Women were placed in the middle, children in the center, all naked, all face up. The bearers worked quickly, using hooked poles to remove clothing, never touching the corpse directly. Even they had limits to the impurity they would accept. The vultures didn't wait for the bearers to leave. They descended in a shrieking cloud, fighting over the softest parts first. The eyes went immediately, then the face. In the desert heat, a body could be stripped to bone in under an hour. But the towers held darker secrets. The wealthy could pay for prime placement, where the birds would find them first. The poor were left on lower platforms, where the vultures, already full, might take days to begin their work. Imagine being the family below, knowing your loved one was rotting in the sun, waiting for birds too full to fly. The priests watched everything from a distance, making notes about which bodies the vultures approached first. They believed the birds' behavior revealed spiritual truths. A quickly consumed corpse meant a pure soul. Bodies the vultures avoided suggested deep corruption. Families waited anxiously for these reports, their loved one's afterlife supposedly hanging in the balance of a bird's appetite. But that wasn't the worst part. Children who died were placed in the center circle, and tradition demanded their mothers watch from a designated platform. They had to witness their babies being consumed, believing that their grief-filled observation would guide the small souls to paradise. Many mothers never recovered from what they saw. The bones that remained after the vulture's feast weren't buried either. They were swept into a central pit and dissolved with lime. Nothing of the person remained, no grave, no marker, just the memory of wings and beaks, and the sound that haunted every Persian's nightmares, the crack of vulture talons on stone. But the pursuit of purity in ancient Persia didn't end with the dead. For the living, contamination was a constant threat, lurking in every touch, every breath, every careless moment. The fear of spiritual pollution shaped daily life, dictating rituals that were as humiliating as they were inescapable. Darius, a high-ranking court official, learned this the hard way. One afternoon, while navigating a crowded market, he accidentally brushed against a corpse. Just a fleeting contact, dead flesh against his silk sleeve. But in the eyes of Persian law, his life was instantly transformed into a waking nightmare. Contact with death brought spiritual contamination that could spread like a plague. The only cure was nong, the urine of a sacred white bull, collected during specific lunar phases and blessed by priests. But this was no simple washing. This was systematic degradation, designed to strip away both contamination and dignity. At sunset, Darius was brought to the purification chamber, a stone room reeking of ammonia and fear. The priests made him strip naked. His contaminated clothes would be burned. Then came the first washing. They poured the bull urine over his head while he recited prayers, the liquid burning his eyes and nose. He had to keep his mouth open, letting the foul substance coat his tongue. But the urine wasn't the worst part. Between each washing, Darius had to declare his spiritual crimes in detail. Every impure thought, every minor transgression, shouted to the priests who recorded each confession. His voice cracked as he admitted to envying his brother's success, to doubting the sacred fire's power during his daughter's illness. The priests showed no emotion. They'd heard it all before. 3 times they doused him. 3 times he confessed. By the third washing, Darius was sobbing, not from the stinging urine, but from the systematic stripping of his private thoughts. His confessions would be kept in temple records, potential weapons if he ever challenged religious authority. Here's where it gets darker. The bull urine had to be consumed as well as applied. A full cup, drunk while the priests chanted. Darius gagged, his body rejecting the foul liquid, but vomiting would mean starting over. He forced it down, bile rising in his throat. The priests watched, ensuring every drop was swallowed. But they weren't finished. The contamination was considered so severe that his entire household required purification. His wife, his children, even his servants all underwent the same ritual. His youngest son, only 7 years old, wept as the priests poured urine over his small frame. The boy's cries echoed through the chamber, but the ritual continued. The collection of this sacred urine was its own horror. Young priests were assigned to follow the sacred bulls constantly, clay vessels ready. The bulls were fed specific herbs to ensure their urine had the proper acidic quality. These priests, despite handling a holy substance, were considered tainted by their proximity to bodily waste. They lived apart, ate apart, and were forbidden from marriage. The words Darius spoke next would seal his fate. During his final confession, he mentioned dreaming about the old gods, the ones Zoroaster had declared demons. The priest's expressions changed. This wasn't simple contamination anymore. This was potential heresy. The purification intensified. They brought out the special mixture, bull urine mixed with crushed herbs and sulfur. This had to be rubbed into every crevice of his body while he recited prayers of submission. The burning was unbearable. His skin turned red, then began to peel. But stopping meant admitting spiritual weakness, which carried its own punishments. Some never recovered from the ritual. The shame, the physical trauma, the public humiliation broke them. They emerged pure but psychologically shattered. Darius survived, but his position at court was never the same. Everyone knew he'd been contaminated, had undergone the ritual. In their eyes, he was forever marked. The most horrifying aspect was how normalized this was. Every Persian family kept emergency supplies of bull urine, knowing contamination could happen instantly. Children were taught the purification prayers before they could properly walk. Markets sold blessed urine and clay vessels. Merchants hawked their wares, boasting of superior purifying properties. One account describes a pregnant woman forced to undergo the ritual after touching her husband's corpse in grief. The shock sent her into early labor. The baby was born during the purification, emerging into a world of urine and chanting. The priests declared the child blessed, born into purity. The mother died from complications days later, her body too weakened by the ritual to recover. If bull urine could cleanse a body, imagine what they did when an entire river was contaminated. The splash echoed across the valley, and with it, 10,000 people lost their water. Rostam had chosen the sacred river for his final act, a suicide that would contaminate the entire water supply for 3 villages. As his body sank beneath the surface, he probably didn't realize the catastrophe he'd just unleashed. Persian water law was absolute. Water was the most sacred element, the source of all purity. To contaminate it was to attack the foundation of existence itself. And now, with a corpse poisoning the flow, an entire region faced a spiritual crisis. The alarm spread faster than the current. Priests rode through the villages, declaring immediate water prohibition. Not a drop could be consumed, used for washing, or even touched until the massive purification ritual was complete. Families stared at their water jars in horror. The same vessels they'd filled that morning now contained spiritual poison. By day 3, the children started showing symptoms not of physical thirst, but of spiritual terror. Emergency supplies were distributed, but the fear was deeper than dehydration. They'd been taught since birth that contaminated water invited demons into the body. Parents watched their children refuse even pure water, convinced they were already possessed. The purification ritual required 9 days and nights. Priests worked in shifts, chanting over the river while pouring mixture after mixture of purifying substances upstream. Sacred fires burned on both banks. Bull urine, always bull urine, was channeled into the water by the barrel. The river turned yellow, then brown, as the natural flow mixed with religious remedy. Here's where it gets even darker. The suicide victim's family was held responsible. They were brought to the riverbank and forced to perform public penance. For 9 days, they stood waist-deep in the contaminated water, chanting apologies to every affected family. The cold mountain river numbed their legs. Several elderly family members collapsed from exposure, but weren't allowed to leave. But the water wasn't just physically contaminated. It was spiritually ruined. Every fish that died, floating to the surface, was evidence of demonic presence. Priests examined each dead creature, looking for signs of possession. They found what they wanted to find: strange markings that proved evil's presence, unusual coloring that suggested supernatural interference. What the priests discovered in the water changed everything. Among the dead fish, they claimed to find one with human eyes, proof that the suicide victim's soul had been fractured, pieces of it possessing river creatures. The entire region flew into panic. If soul fragments could enter animals, what about the water people had already consumed? Mass purification followed. Every person who drank from the river in the past month underwent the ritual cleansing. The temples couldn't handle the crowds. People waited in lines for days, terror growing with each hour. Some families attempted their own purifications, mixing whatever they thought might help, resulting in poisonings that priests blamed on demonic influence. The economic devastation was immediate. Crops couldn't be watered. Animals refused to drink the yellowish mixture flowing past. Trade routes that depended on river crossings shut down. But suggesting the ritual should be shortened was heresy. Better to starve than risk spiritual contamination. One merchant tried to bring water from distant wells. Seeing opportunity in crisis, the priests had him arrested for attempting to circumvent divine purification. His punishment was poetic. Forced to drink only river water during the contamination period, he survived but claimed the taste never left his mouth. The psychological damage lasted generations. Children who lived through the water terror grew up with obsessive habits. They'd check water sources multiple times before drinking. Some developed rituals of their own, unauthorized prayers and protective gestures that technically constituted heresy, but were too widespread to punish. The river itself was never the same. The massive amounts of purifying substances had killed most aquatic life. The bull urine and ceremonial chemicals had altered the water's composition. But the priests declared it the purest river in Persia, sanctified by trial. Villagers were required to make pilgrimages to drink from it to prove their faith in the purification. Records show at least 3 more suicides in that river over the following years. People who'd lived through the first contamination and couldn't bear the thought of repeating it. Each time, the cycle began again. 9 days of terror, 9 days of ritual, 9 days of a community holding its breath. But if water could be purified, blood was another matter entirely. In ancient Persia, blood was life, sacred, powerful, and dangerous. To spill it on the earth was to risk contaminating the very ground itself. So, the Persians invented deaths that kept blood inside the body, methods that prolonged agony while maintaining spiritual purity. The execution pits were masterworks of cruel engineering, carved into solid rock. They were barely wider than a man's shoulders and just deep enough that the victim couldn't climb out. Smooth walls offered no handholds. At the bottom, a small drainage hole prevented rainwater accumulation. They wanted death by thirst, not drowning. The condemned received food, but only dry bread, lowered on a rope each morning. This wasn't mercy, but calculated cruelty. The bread would sustain life while increasing thirst. Guards recorded how long each prisoner lasted, creating detailed charts of human endurance. The average was 4 days. The record was 12. By the 4th day, the hallucinations began. The thief in the pit started conversing with people who weren't there. His dead mother, the fire god Atta coming to reclaim what was stolen. The guards listened, taking notes. These final ravings were considered prophetic messages from the boundary between life and death. Families could visit but not help. They'd gather around the pit's edge, looking down at their loved one dying by degrees. Speaking was forbidden. Sound might ease the condemned's suffering. They could only watch as dehydration took its course. Many family members required restraining when delirium set in, and their loved one no longer recognized them. Some pits had variations. In the desert regions, they'd position mirrors to reflect sunlight into the hole, accelerating dehydration. In the mountains, they'd leave the condemned exposed during winter, adding freezing to thirst. Each region perfected its own bloodless torment. What the condemned carved into the wall would be hidden for centuries. Using his fingernails and fragments of bread crust, the thief scraped a message into the stone. not last words or pleas for forgiveness, but detailed accusations against the priest who'd convicted him, claims of corruption, of sacred fire being sold to wealthy patrons. Guards saw the scratching but couldn't read the messages in the dark pit. The execution methods varied by crime. Those who contaminated water were buried alive in sand, their heads covered by clay pots with small air holes. Death took hours as sand pressure slowly crushed their chests. Witnesses described the sounds, not screams, but a horrible whistling as victims fought for each breath through the tiny openings. For heretics, they used the boats, two wooden vessels sealed together with the condemned inside, head and limbs protruding through holes, force-fed milk and honey. The victim developed severe diarrhea, while wasps and flies, attracted by the sweet coating applied to their face, slowly consumed exposed flesh. No blood spilled, just slow consumption by nature. The guards assigned to execution grounds developed their own culture. They'd place bets on survival times, share stories of unusual deaths, develop theories about which prayers might extend or shorten suffering. Many turned to drink, haunted by what they witnessed. Others became devotees, seeing divine justice in extended agony. One account describes a woman convicted of adultery, sentenced to the pressing stones. Placed between two flat rocks, weight was gradually added, a stone at a time, over days. The goal was to crush without breaking skin. Guards had to monitor carefully, removing weight if blood appeared likely. She lasted 6 days, her ribs slowly compressing until breathing became impossible. The punishment for speaking a forbidden name was worse than death. Some prisoners tried to die faster by holding their breath or bashing their heads against the pit walls. Guards prevented this with nets and padding. Death had to come naturally, following heaven's timeline. Suicide attempts resulted in the sentence extending to family members. Children born to condemned women in the pits presented theological problems. If the mother died during childbirth, was the blood spiritual or natural? Priests debated while women labored in stone holes. The solution was typically to remove the infant immediately after birth, leaving the mother to die alone while her child was raised by temple servants. The most disturbing element was public normalization. Execution grounds became social spaces. Vendors sold food to spectators. Children played between the pits while their parents gossiped. The dying provided background noise to daily life. Their suffering was so common it became ignorable. But death was only one form of erasure. In Persia, the ultimate punishment was not execution, but memory execution. The hammer struck stone, and with each blow, another memory disappeared. General Vahim had commanded 10,000 men, won dozens of battles, and built monuments across the empire. Now, as the mason's chisel bit into marble, his name vanished letter by letter. By sunset, it would be as if he'd never existed. Memory execution was reserved for those whose crimes threatened the cosmic order itself. Vahim had conspired against the king, but his real crime was deeper. He'd suggested the royal bloodline lacked divine mandate. For this heresy, death wasn't enough. He had to be unmade. The process was methodical. First came the physical execution, private, bloodless, witnessed only by priests. Then began the true punishment. Every inscription bearing his name was located and destroyed. Every document mentioning his deeds was burned. Every statue showing his face was ground to powder. The empire's vast bureaucracy turned its full attention to erasing one man. His family was forced to participate. His wife had to burn their marriage contract. His sons had to chisel their father's name from the family tomb. His daughters watched their dowry documents, proof of their noble lineage, turn to ash. Refusing meant sharing his fate. But the erasure went deeper than just physical records. Speaking his name became punishable by death, thinking it was considered spiritual contamination. Families developed elaborate codes, referring to him as the absence, or the one who wasn't. Children grew up knowing they had a grandfather, but not his name, achievements, or face. His daughter found a way to remember. She wore a ring with symbols that looked decorative, but spelled his name in ancient script. For 30 years, she carried this secret reminder. When finally discovered, her punishment was poetic. Her own name was erased. Her existence was negated for preserving what should have been forgotten. The theological reasoning was terrifying in its logic. Persians believed names held power beyond death. In the afterlife, souls needed their names to exist. Without them, they became nothing, not even capable of punishment or redemption. Just gone. Priests taught that erased ones wandered the void between worlds, conscious but unable to act, speak, or be perceived. The state employed special investigators, memory hunters, who searched for hidden references. They'd interrogate slaves about overheard conversations, examine children's drawings for suspicious figures, and analyze poetry for coded mentions. One hunter proudly recorded finding a reference hidden in a recipe, ingredient measurements that, when converted to letters, spelled the forbidden name. What they found in the mass grave changed Persian law. During construction of a new temple, workers uncovered a burial site. Inside were dozens of bodies, all with faces chiseled away, all missing their name tags. But one corpse clutched a clay tablet covered in names, all erased ones, preserved by someone who couldn't bear their total loss. The discovery sparked a theological crisis. If someone remembered the erased, did they partially exist? The priest's solution was horrifying. They declared the tablet itself cursed, capable of resurrecting the unnamed. Everyone who'd read it underwent memory purification, a process involving meditation, fasting, and systematic forgetting guided by priests. Artists faced particular challenges. Historical paintings, including erased figures, had to be modified, but simply painting over them left spiritual residue. The solution was complete recreation, copying everything except the forbidden presence. Museums held before and after versions. The differences highlighted the absent spaces where people once stood. The punishment for speaking his name was worse than death. A merchant accidentally mentioned an erased general while telling war stories. His sentence: partial erasure. His name could be spoken but not written. His face could be remembered but not depicted. He lived the rest of his life in limbo, existing but incomplete, a warning to others about the gradations of non-existence. But not everyone in Persia was even granted the dignity of a name to lose. Beneath the surface of Persian society, another group lived and died in the shadows: the Mardu, the untouchable underclass. They were the invisible hands that built the empire, worked its fields, and maintained its infrastructure, yet they were never considered fully human. The Mardu were often war captives or the descendants of those conquered generations before. Their status was hereditary and absolute. Children born to Mardu inherited their parents' untouchable status, marked from birth by a brand on the forehead, a symbol that declared them spiritually dead. The brand wasn't just identification, it was a theological statement. These beings, the priests taught, had no souls to save. They were spiritual pollution in physical form, failed reincarnations, or, in some texts, the descendants of demons who had bred with humans in mythical times. The Mardu lived apart, downwind and downstream from Persian settlements. They couldn't use the same water sources, walk the same paths, or even breathe upwind of their betters. Special routes were designated for Mardu movement, narrow alleys between buildings where they could pass unseen. To be seen was to risk punishment, for both the Mardu and any Persian who acknowledged them. When a Mardu died, they couldn't be given to the vultures. That was for humans. They couldn't be buried. Earth was too sacred. They couldn't be burned. Fire was divine. So, they were dumped in abandoned irrigation channels, construction pits, or garbage heaps. No ceremony, no acknowledgement, just disposal. The overseers who managed these tasks faced their own dilemmas. Moving the bones required touching them, but Mardu's remains were considered toxic waste. Persian workers wouldn't do it. Using living Mardu risked them recognizing ancestors, potentially sparking unrest. The solution was as cruel as it was efficient. Mardu children were ordered to clear the bones, told these were animal remains. They worked for days, collecting skeletal fragments in baskets, sometimes finding personal items, a clay doll, a wooden charm, reminders that these bones once belonged to people who loved and were loved. The Mardu developed their own religious practices, secret prayers, and rituals whispered in the dark. When investigators discovered tablets inscribed with these prayers in a mass grave, it triggered fierce theological debate. Progressive priests argued this showed the Mardu had souls worth saving. Conservative clergy claimed it was blasphemy, animals mimicking human behavior. The debate ended when the Shah declared the tablets cursed objects. They were destroyed, and laws were passed forbidding Mardu from any religious expression. Disease outbreaks often started in Mardu quarters, spreading through overcrowded, unsanitary conditions. But when plague reached Persian neighborhoods, the Mardu were blamed for poisoning the air with their spiritual corruption. Mass cullings followed, not executions, but cleanings, as if removing waste rather than killing people. One account describes a Persian child who accidentally played with a Mardu child, not recognizing the forehead brand. When discovered, both children underwent different punishments. The Persian child was purified with elaborate rituals. The Mardu child was beaten to death, not for playing, but for allowing a Persian to be contaminated by their presence. The generational trauma was inescapable. Mardu children grew up knowing they were considered less than human. They internalized the theology, many believing they truly were soulless. Suicide rates were high, but even in death, they found no dignity. Bodies dumped with the same indifference as broken tools. Some Mardu attempted escape, fleeing to neighboring kingdoms, but the forehead brands marked them everywhere. Most were returned under treaty agreements, facing punishments that served as examples to others. Those who removed their brands were hunted specially. Their crime wasn't escape, but identity theft, pretending to be a humanity they couldn't possess. The system's end came not from moral awakening, but practical necessity. As the empire weakened, maintaining strict separation became impossible. Mardu and Persian blood mixed during chaos and invasion. The theological framework collapsed when faced with reality. How do you classify the humanity of children whose parents crossed the uncrossable divide? But even the Mardu would have chosen their fate over what some Persian families did in the name of purity. In the highest echelons of society, the pursuit of spiritual perfection led to practices that would be unthinkable anywhere else. She knew the wedding date, her 16th birthday, and she knew the groom, her father. Golar had been prepared for this moment since childhood. Taught that the purest blood came from the closest unions, the priests called it Swidoda, the highest form of marriage, blessed by Ahura Mazda himself. The practice wasn't hidden in shame, but celebrated as a spiritual achievement. Families who practiced Swidoda were considered holier, their bloodlines closer to divine perfection. The closer the relation, the greater the blessing, father and daughter, mother and son, brother and sister. Each combination had its own theological ranking and social status. Golar's preparation began at age 7. Special tutors, always women who'd undergone similar marriages, taught her the sacred duties. She learned specific prayers for consummation, ritual positions that maximized spiritual benefit, and mental exercises to transform natural revulsion into religious ecstasy. Her mother's advice was more disturbing than silence. Having married her own uncle at 14, she spoke of transcending human emotion to achieve divine union. She taught Golar dissociation techniques disguised as meditation, ways to separate mind from body during intimate moments. The lessons were practical: how to hide physical pain, how to feign enthusiasm, how to produce heirs despite bodily rebellion. The theological framework was elaborate. Priests taught that human souls split at creation, scattered across bloodlines. Zwidoda reunited these fragments, creating spiritually complete beings. Children from such unions were considered partially divine, born with intact souls that didn't require the usual purification rituals. The wedding ceremony itself inverted normal celebrations. Instead of keeping the bride and groom separate before marriage, they were required to spend 3 days together in isolation, performing bonding rituals that would be criminal in any other context. Priests monitored these sessions, ensuring proper protocols were followed. The priest's blessing contained a horrible truth. During the ceremony, he spoke of cosmic balance, of how their union would strengthen the forces of light against darkness. But his real message was control. Families practicing Zwidoda were so socially isolated, so dependent on religious approval, they'd never challenge authority. The physical consequences were hidden but devastating. Infant mortality was high among Zwidoda offspring. Those who survived often bore genetic markers of close breeding, distinctive features that identified them as products of sacred unions. These children were simultaneously revered and pitted, trapped in bloodlines that spiraled ever inward. Some women found ways to resist. Secret networks provided herbal contraceptives, claiming religious fasting while actually preventing pregnancy. Others arranged affairs with servants, passing off outside children as sacred offspring. The punishment for discovery was severe, not for adultery, but for contaminating divine bloodlines with common genes. The practice created genealogical nightmares. Families tracked bloodlines obsessively, calculating degrees of relation to maximize spiritual benefit. A woman might be simultaneously daughter, wife, and aunt to the same man. Children couldn't determine their actual parentage, raised by committees of interrelated relatives. Mental breakdown was common but unacknowledged. Women who went mad were said to be overwhelmed by divine presence. Men who became impotent were declared too pure for physical union. The terminology transformed trauma into transcendence, making suffering seem like a spiritual achievement. One account describes a girl who fled rather than marry her father. She was captured and returned, facing public trial for spiritual cowardice. Her defense, that the relationship felt wrong, was treated as evidence of corruption. She was forced to undergo purification before the wedding proceeded. She never spoke again, her silence interpreted as holy contemplation. The children of these unions faced unique challenges. Many were brilliant but unstable, their intelligence twisted by the cognitive dissonance of their existence. They were raised to see their conception as sacred, while their bodies bore evidence of genetic damage. Some became fanatic supporters of the system, others its fiercest secret critics. The practice wasn't universal. Common Persians often couldn't afford the elaborate ceremonies and settlements required, but they faced pressure to emulate nobility. Village priests encouraged cousin marriages as stepping stones to holier unions. The entire society bent toward collapsing bloodlines, chasing purity that produced its opposite. Historical records show the practice's decline coincided with military defeats. Enemy propaganda highlighted Zwidoda as evidence of Persian degeneracy. Occupied territories abandoned the practice immediately, suggesting compliance had always been forced rather than faithful. The most disturbing legacy was psychological. Generations raised in Zwidoda families carried trauma in their cells and psyches. Even after the practice ended, they struggled with boundaries, relationships, and identity. The pursuit of purity had created damage that would echo through bloodlines for centuries. At least Golar could look her father in the eyes. That was a privilege denied to most in the presence of the king. The messenger had practiced for days. Deliver the news, never look up, live another day. Now, standing before the golden throne, sweat dripped from his lowered face as he recited the urgent dispatch from the eastern provinces. His eyes burned from the strain of staring at the intricate floor patterns. But even blinking felt dangerous. The law was absolute. To look upon the Shah's face without permission meant immediate execution. This wasn't mere protocol, but cosmic necessity. The Shah was considered the earthly reflection of Ahura Mazda, the good god. Mortal eyes gazing upon such divinity would be burned by spiritual radiance. A mercy killing to prevent the observer's soul from being destroyed. The messenger's neck muscles screamed as he maintained his downward angle. He'd heard stories of others who'd failed. A young scribe who'd glanced up reflexively when the Shah sneezed was beheaded before the echo faded. A general who'd met the royal eyes while receiving honors was struck down despite decades of loyal service. Here's where it gets twisted. The Shah himself became prisoner to this system. Unable to make normal eye contact, he lived in a bubble of averted gazes. His own children couldn't look at him directly. His wives focused on his feet during intimate moments. He experienced human connection only through mirrors and intermediaries. The court developed elaborate workarounds. Conversations happened through interpreters who could look at neither party directly. Artists painted royal portraits from memory or stolen glances, risking their lives for accuracy. Some created theoretical portraits, imagining divine features rather than observing them. His eyes began to water, but blinking might be fatal. The messenger had heard of the test. Sometimes guards would claim the Shah had left, encouraging messengers to look up. Those who did were executed for attempting to gaze upon royalty. Those who didn't were sometimes killed for disrespect, for not confirming the Shah's absence. Every interaction was a potentially lethal puzzle. The isolation drove some Shahs mad. One ruler, desperate for genuine human contact, would visit prisoners condemned to die anyway. He'd remove his veil and talk face to face with men hours from execution, the only people allowed to see him as human rather than a deity. Guards reported he often wept during these sessions. Children raised in the palace learned elaborate movement patterns to avoid accidental gazes. They played with heads tilted down, navigated by peripheral vision, and developed neck problems from constant genuflection. The lucky ones were sent away young before the habits became permanent. The Shah's response would change protocol forever. This particular ruler, perhaps sensing the messenger's distress, made an unprecedented decision. He ordered mirrors installed throughout the throne room. Now, supplicants could see him indirectly, and he could observe their faces without triggering execution orders. It was revolutionary, heretical. Conservative priests argued mirrors didn't solve the theological problem. Reflected divinity was still divinity. Some demanded the messenger's execution retroactively. The debate paralyzed the court for weeks while the messenger waited in prison, unsure if his innovative audience had saved or doomed him. The mirror solution created new problems. Courtiers had to learn to read expressions in reverse. Misunderstandings multiplied when left and right were confused in reflections. One ambassador, unfamiliar with the system, spoke to the Shah's reflection while the actual ruler sat elsewhere, creating a diplomatic incident. Some nobles found ways to exploit the system. They'd arrange accidents where rivals might glimpse royalty, a carelessly placed mirror, a sudden movement drawing reflexive glances, political assassination through induced sight. The court became a battlefield of angles and reflections. The most disturbing aspect was the children born with deformities that prevented upward gazing. When the taboo lasted generations, some families developed genetic conditions, twisted necks, malformed spines that made looking up impossible. These deformities were considered blessings, divine insurance against accidental heresy. Palace servants developed their own culture around the restriction. They communicated through floor patterns, leaving messages in dust and tile arrangements. They recognized each other by shoe styles and walking patterns. Some went years working in the same halls without ever seeing colleagues' faces. Artists faced unique challenges. Commissioned to create royal portraits for provinces, they worked from descriptions provided by priests who'd glimpsed the Shah during religious ceremonies. The results were idealized to the point of abstraction, divine light radiating from faces that bore no resemblance to the actual ruler. The system finally collapsed during a plague outbreak. The Shah, needing to coordinate response directly with officials, suspended the gazing prohibition temporarily. The crisis passed, but the spell was broken. Officials who'd seen the Shah's very human fear during the epidemic couldn't return to treating him as an untouchable divinity. But if the king's gaze could kill, Persian justice could do worse. The law demanded not just obedience, but participation. When a murder occurred, the family of the victim was required to become executioners themselves. The concept of kunbahar, blood price, was not optional in Persian society. When someone was murdered, their family had to seek vengeance. Not doing so was considered a spiritual betrayal of the deceased. The dead couldn't rest while their killer lived. Worse, families who forgave were seen as accomplices to murder. Their mercy is interpreted as approval. The judge's ruling left them no choice. The Yazdi family had 40 days to execute Baba, the man who had killed their son in a drunken fight. The method was prescribed. They must use the same weapon that killed their son, a farming sickle. The execution must be public, witnessed by both families. Any hesitation, any sign of mercy, would result in charges of impiety. Here's where it gets darker. Baba's family couldn't interfere, but were required to watch. They stood in designated areas, forbidden from crying out or closing their eyes. This wasn't just punishment, but generational bonding. Their children would grow up obligated to avenge Baba, continuing the cycle. The law recognized this would create endless vengeance chains. The solution was perverse. After executing mandated revenge, families underwent purification rituals that supposedly severed spiritual connections. They drank from cups mixed with the victim's blood and their own, symbolically merging the bloodlines to end distinction between killer and killed. But the system created professional vengeance takers. Some families, too weak or squeamish to execute justice themselves, hired specialists. These men made their living performing familial revenge, traveling between provinces to kill on behalf of others. They were simultaneously necessary and despised, paid in gold but banned from temples. What they did instead would inspire a rebellion. The Yazdis, in desperation, proposed an alternative. They would adopt Baba as their son, replacing the one he'd killed. The theological argument was clever. If Baba became family, the murder transformed into accidental fratricide, requiring different penalties. The priests debated for weeks. The proposal had precedent, but dangerous implications. If families could adopt their way out of vengeance, the entire justice system might collapse. They finally ruled against it, declaring the adoption attempt itself blasphemous, trying to circumvent divine justice through legal trickery. The execution proceeded on schedule. The eldest Yazdi son, barely 16, was chosen to wield the sickle. His hands shook so badly that the first strike missed, cutting Baba's shoulder instead of his neck. By law, he had to continue until death was achieved. It took 7 strikes. Both families were destroyed, one by loss, one by being forced to become murderers. The psychological toll was documented by temple scribes. Families who carried out vengeance often experienced collective breakdown. Suicide rates spiked among those forced to kill. Children raised in revenge cultures showed increased violence, decreased empathy, and an inability to form trusting relationships. Some regions developed horrifying traditions around mandatory vengeance, annual gatherings where multiple executions were performed together, turning justice into festival. Children were given toy weapons and practiced on effigies of their future victims. Pregnant women touched execution weapons to their bellies, ensuring unborn children would inherit the obligation. Secret forgiveness rituals emerged in resistance. Families would publicly perform vengeance on criminals already condemned to die, claiming they were the specific murderers of their relatives. Bodies were mutilated to prevent identification. These merciful frauds required elaborate coordination and absolute secrecy. The most disturbing cases involved child murderers. When a child accidentally killed another, both sets of parents faced impossible choices. The victim's family had to execute a child or face punishment. The killer's family had to watch their child die or be branded spiritual failures. Some families fled together, becoming refugees rather than participants. In fact, family murders created genealogical nightmares. When cousins killed cousins, determining who had vengeance rights became complex. Both families might have equal claims, leading to competing executions. One recorded case involved 17 deaths over 3 generations. The original murderers caused long forgotten. The empire tried reforms periodically: blood money substitutions, symbolic executions using effigies, exile as an alternative to death. But conservative priests always reversed these changes, arguing that mercy toward murderers was cruelty toward victims. The cycle continued, generation after generation of mandated violence. One account describes a woman who spent 30 years tracking her brother's killer across the empire. When she finally found him, he was elderly, surrounded by grandchildren who'd never known his crime. She completed her duty, stabbing him during a family meal, then immediately took her own life, unable to bear what obligation had made her become. But once a year, even the law couldn't protect you from the mob. The sun set, the drums began, and every priest in Persia started running. The festival of disorder had begun. One night when the cosmic order reversed, when the sacred became profane, when hunting holy men was not just permitted but celebrated, young priest Ardashir had planned his hiding spot for months. But as screaming mobs filled the streets, he wondered if anywhere was safe. This annual purge traced back to ancient times, a pressure valve built into the rigid religious system. For one night, grievances against clergy could be expressed violently. Priests who'd performed harsh purifications, ordered cruel punishments, or extracted excessive tithes became prey. The theological justification was that chaos must be acknowledged to be controlled. The rules were specific but horrifying. From sunset to sunrise, clergy lost their protected status. They couldn't seek sanctuary in temples; those were barricaded shut. They couldn't invoke divine protection; the gods were supposedly sleeping. They could only run, hide, and pray for dawn. The festival wasn't random violence, but organized hunting. Neighborhoods formed teams, planned strategies, and shared information about priest movements. They prepared for weeks, mapping escape routes, identifying hiding spots, and crafting non-lethal but painful weapons. The goal wasn't necessarily murder, but humiliation and pain. The mob was 3 streets away when Ardashir made his choice. He could hear their chant, names of people the local priests had condemned, families ruined by religious judgments. His own name featured prominently. He'd ordered a child's purification that resulted in death from exposure. The parents led tonight's hunt. Some priests tried disguises, but congregations knew their mannerisms too well. Others attempted to flee the cities, but rural areas had their own hunts, often more vicious due to isolation's built-up resentments. The clever ones had been leaving incrementally for weeks, claiming religious missions to be elsewhere during the festival. The violence was ritualized, but real. Captured priests were stripped, shaved, and forced to consume impure substances. Some were made to perform their own purification rituals incorrectly, blasphemous inversions that supposedly stripped their spiritual authority. Others were branded with marks of shame that would last for a year round. What Ardashir witnessed in the temple would break his faith. Despite official closure, he had hidden inside, believing stone walls and sacred ground would offer protection. He found dozens of other priests with the same idea. As the mob broke through barricaded doors, the clergy turned on each other, offering up unpopular colleagues to save themselves. The betrayals were swift and brutal. Senior priests identified juniors who'd questioned doctrine. Temple administrators pointed out those who'd skimmed offerings. The mob became judge, jury, and executioner, while priests became informants, trading others' lives for their own. The temple floors ran red with blood that wasn't supposed to be shed on holy ground. The festival served multiple functions beyond revenge. It reinforced priestly power by showing what happened when that power was temporarily removed: chaos, violence, social breakdown. Many citizens, horrified by their own actions during the night, became more devout afterward, seeking forgiveness for their temporary madness. But some years, the controlled chaos escaped bounds. If particularly hated priests were killed, their colleagues might refuse to perform rituals afterward, leaving communities without spiritual services. The empire would intervene, punishing excessive violence while carefully maintaining the festival's existence as a necessary outlet. The most disturbing accounts come from priests who survived multiple festivals. They described psychological torture worse than physical, spending the entire year knowing another night of horror approached. Many developed paranoid behaviors, seeing potential hunters in every congregant. Some mutilated themselves, hoping disfigurement would make them unrecognizable. Children participated eagerly, turning priest hunting into a coming-of-age ritual. They'd practice violence on effigies, compete to devise humiliating punishments, bond over shared brutality. Parents encouraged this, seeing it as necessary preparation for maintaining social order through controlled disorder. The dawn aftermath was surreal. As first light appeared, violence ceased instantly. Hunters helped wounded priests to temples for treatment. Some apologized for excessive enthusiasm. Others made appointments for next week's purification rituals. The cosmic order reasserted itself, but memories lingered. Ardashir survived by betraying 3 colleagues and submitting to public humiliation that left him scarred physically and spiritually. The next morning, he performed purifications for the same mob that had tortured him hours earlier. His hands shook as he blessed their children, knowing they'd been taught to see him as prey. The festival's end came not from moral evolution, but practical necessity. As the empire weakened, maintaining rigid social order became impossible. The controlled chaos became uncontrolled, spreading beyond single nights. The last festival devolved into weeks of long religious warfare that contributed to imperial collapse. Ardashir survived the night, but nothing could prepare him for what awaited in the court of justice. The leather creaked again as Otanes shifted, and suddenly we're back where we began. The judge's son, whose name was Otanes, had been sitting on his father's skin for 3 hours now. The first case was about to begin. A merchant accused of watering wine stood before him, but all Otanes could think about was the warmth beneath him that shouldn't exist. Human leather, he discovered, retained heat differently than animal hide. His first major verdict would define everything. The courtroom watched, waiting to see if sitting on his father's corruption would make him just or break him entirely. The merchant's crime was minor, normally punishable by fine. But Otanes felt his father beneath him, remembered the king's words, "Let every judgment remind you of judgment's price." The details of the chair haunted him more each day. He discovered his father's face had been preserved and placed on the backrest. Eyes closed, mouth sewn shut, positioned so Otanes would feel breath that would never come on his neck. The armrests were his father's arms, hands positioned palm up in eternal supplication. Here's where the story turns. Otanes made a decision that would echo through Persian legal history. He declared the merchant guilty, but refused to sentence him. Instead, he stood from the chair and spoke words that bordered on heresy. "I cannot dispense justice while sitting on injustice. This chair makes a mockery of the law by making me part of the crime." The courtroom erupted. Some saw blasphemy against the king's wisdom. Others saw the first crack in a system that had normalized horror as justice. Otanes continued, his voice growing stronger. "My father took bribes and died for it. But making me sit on his remains makes me complicit in cruelty that corrupts justice more than gold ever could." Guards moved to arrest him, but Otanes wasn't finished. He revealed what he'd learned while investigating his father's case. The bribe his father took had been to save an innocent man from execution. The accuser had been lying, seeking to steal the man's property. His father had known the truth and chosen mercy over law. Now Otanes sat on the skin of a man who died for preventing injustice. The revelation shattered the courtroom's certainty. If the skin chair was meant to remind judges of corruption's price, what did it mean when the corruption was compassion? The paradox paralyzed the legal system. How could they punish injustice with greater injustice? How could they seek justice for murdered mercy? Otanes' stand inspired others. Judges across the empire began questioning not just verdicts but the system itself. Some refused to use traditional punishments. Others investigated old cases, finding similar paradoxes: justice served through injustice, purity maintained through defilement, order preserved through chaos. The empire tried to silence dissent, but ideas once released couldn't be unskinned. The more they punished questioning, the more questions arose. The chair that was meant to ensure compliance became the symbol of resistance. Artists drew it in hidden places. Poets coded it into verses. Philosophers used it to demonstrate the contradictions that would eventually break the empire. Looking back at Persian civilization, we see this duality everywhere. The same culture that created the Cyrus cylinder, the world's first charter of human rights, also perfected psychological tortures that would damage bloodlines for generations. They built elaborate systems to maintain cosmic order, while creating rituals that normalized cosmic horror. The obsession with purity created profound impurity. Trying to avoid death contamination, they built towers where vultures turned the sacred into spectacle. Pursuing bloodline perfection, they normalized incest that produced a genetic catastrophe. Seeking divine justice, they created human furniture that made justice impossible. Perhaps that's the warning Persia offers. When purity becomes obsession, when order demands cruelty, when justice requires injustice, the system contains its own destruction. The skin chair stands as a monument to this truth. You cannot build righteousness on cruelty's foundation without both collapsing. The final archaeological note is haunting. The chair was never found. Some say it was destroyed when the empire fell. Others believe it was hidden, waiting. But in Persian ruins, archaeologists sometimes find small leather fragments with unusual preservation, unexplained warmth, and DNA that matches no known animal. They catalogue these finds quietly, professionally, and try not to think about what they might be holding. The empire fell, but its lessons remain, written in blood. preserved in memory, waiting for those who think their own systems of justice and purity could never become horrors normalized by time and power. The chair creaks still in every courtroom where justice forgets its own humanity. History doesn't repeat, but it echoes. And sometimes, if you listen carefully, you can hear the leather creak. But the echoes of Persia's shocking practices don't just linger in ruins or in the nightmares of archaeologists. They live on in the questions we ask about our own societies. What rituals do we perform? What cruelties do we normalize in the name of order, purity, or progress? What will future generations find unthinkable about our own normal? The Persians believed they were building a civilization of cosmic balance, of light over darkness, of justice over chaos. Yet in their pursuit of perfection, they created systems that broke bodies, minds, and souls. The stories of Otanes, Golar, Darius, Ardashir, and the countless unnamed Mardu are not just tales of the past. They are warnings. Warnings that the line between civilization and savagery is thinner than we think. That the pursuit of purity can become its own form of corruption. That justice, when stripped of humanity, becomes indistinguishable from cruelty. The Persians left us poetry, mathematics, architecture, and the world's first declaration of human rights. But they also left us the memory of the skin chair, the towers of silence, the festival of disorder, and the rituals that turned suffering into spectacle. If you walk the ruins of Persepolis at dusk, you might feel the weight of these stories pressing in from the shadows. The stones remember. The wind carries whispers of names erased, of children branded, of mothers forced to watch the unwatchable. The past is never truly past. It waits, patient and silent, for those willing to listen. And if you listen closely, you might hear the creak of leather, the echo of a civilization that tried to build order on the bones of its own people. So the next time you hear someone say, "That's just how things were back then," remember Persia. Remember that what is normal is only what we allow ourselves to accept. And remember that the most shocking practices are often the ones we refuse to see in our own time. The ruins of ancient Persia are silent now, but the questions they raise are louder than ever. What does it mean to be civilized? Is it the monuments we build, the laws we write, or the rituals we perform? Or is it the way we treat the most vulnerable, the outcasts, the ones whose suffering is easiest to ignore? The Persians believed in cosmic order, in a universe where every action had its place, every impurity its remedy, every crime its punishment. But in their relentless pursuit of order, they created a world where cruelty became routine, where suffering was sanctified, and where the line between justice and horror blurred until it vanished. The story of Otanes and the skin chair is not just a tale of one judge or one empire. It is a mirror held up to every society that has ever justified cruelty in the name of something greater. It is a warning that the systems we build to protect ourselves can become the very engines of our undoing. The Persians thought they could control chaos by ritualizing it, purify souls by humiliating bodies, and preserve justice by making it unforgettable. But in the end, the rituals outlived their meaning, the punishments outgrew their purpose, and the echoes of suffering became the true legacy of their civilization. We like to think we are different. We like to believe that our own normal is built on reason, compassion, and progress. But history is not a straight line. It is a spiral, circling back on itself, repeating patterns in new forms. The shocking practices of ancient Persia were not born of evil, but of fear, fear of chaos, fear of impurity, fear of losing control. And in that fear, they found comfort in rituals that, to us, seem monstrous. Yet every society has its own blind spots, its own rituals of exclusion, humiliation, and violence. The question is not whether we have moved beyond the horrors of the past, but whether we are willing to see the horrors of our present. So as you leave this story behind, ask yourself, what are the skin chairs of our own time? What rituals do we perform without question? Whose suffering do we ignore because it is easier than facing the truth? The Persians built an empire that tried to make justice visible, unforgettable, inescapable. But in doing so, they taught us a lesson they never intended: that true justice cannot be built on cruelty, that true purity cannot be achieved by exclusion, and that the most dangerous horrors are the ones we call normal. Listen for the echoes. Question what you accept. And never forget the creak of leather in the silence of a courtroom, or the lessons whispered by the ruins of a fallen empire. Because history doesn't just echo, it waits for someone to listen and to choose differently.